Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program at the Commonwealth Club. My name is Quentin Hardy. I'm the head of editorial at Google Cloud, and I'm pleased to be your moderator for tonight's program. Joining us this evening is Jonathan Haidt, social psychologist, Thomas Cooley Professor of Ethical Leadership at NYU's Stern School of Business, and co-author of the new book, The Coddling of the American Mind: How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. Something extraordinary, he says, is happening on college campuses today. While schools portray themselves as centers of academic achievement and innovative endeavor, Haidt and his co-author, George Lukianoff, argue that concerns about free speech, trigger warnings, and microaggressions are crippling these institutions and the students inside them, leaving students unprepared for the real world after college and setting up their generation for failure. Words are seen as a source of danger, he writes, creating inadvertently mental prisons that trap our next generation, particularly the graduates of some of our most elite institutions. Tonight, I hope to inquire as to why this has happened and what might be done about it. We're excited to welcome him here tonight to discuss these issues and more. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Jonathan Haidt to the Commonwealth Club. Now, just to say, Professor Haidt will open with a brief 15 minutes of PowerPoint, and then I'll join him on stage to talk about the book and what he's shown us.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Quentin. It's a pleasure to be here in this beautiful space and to have the chance to talk to you about about the book, which just came out a week ago, and just a few hours ago I found out it will be number 7 on the New York Times bestseller list this weekend. Now, how many people here in the audience were born in or after 1995? Anyone? Raise your hand if you were. Okay, we have a few. How many of you in the audience have children or grandchildren who were born in or after 1995? Raise your hand. Okay, about a third of the audience. And how many of you care about children in some way, shape, or form? Raise your hand. Okay. And then I could ask the same question about universities. How many of you care about universities and generally have positive feelings towards them? You want them to raise your hand if you generally like universities and you want them. Okay. So I'm going to talk tonight about children and universities. And I'll just give it's helpful to have a kind of a narrative, a story about a book. Like, what is this book? How did it come about? What's the central idea? And then Quentin and I will talk about it. We have this idealized notion of universities. Certainly in the academy, we think of ourselves as the descendants of Socrates and of Plato's academy. We think that there is a special kind of space in which people can argue in good faith. There is no violence. We talk about ideas. And in the conflict, in this very civil kind of conflict, the truth comes out, where you could not find the truth just by yourself. So this is what we think of ourselves. This is our cultural heritage. The purpose of university, the telos, the function, is truth, seeking of truth. And you can see this clearly in the crests. At Harvard, the word is veritas, or truth. Yale is lux et veritas. So it's usually light, truth, or knowledge. Those are the 3 words that you find on most of the crests. At Cal, of course, it's let there be light on the bottom there. I taught for 16 years at the University of Virginia, and Thomas Jefferson wrote when he was founding the university, "For here we are not afraid to follow truth wherever it may lead," etc. There's a sense of fearlessness. You have to be bold. You have to be willing to question, to challenge, as Socrates was. So this is what we think of ourselves. This is what we think is necessary for a university to work well. But what happened beginning in 2014 is my co-author, Greg Lukianoff, began to notice a lot of fear. He began to notice a change in the culture, in the atmosphere among the undergraduates, not the faculty. This was a change in the students. Greg is the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. They've been fighting against speech codes and the little free speech zones and efforts by administrators to restrict the freedom of speech of students. So he'd been doing that since around the year 2000. And in 2007, he's been prone to depression his whole life, his whole adult life. But he had a really serious bout in 2007, which we describe in the book in chapter 7. And as a result of that, he learned how to do cognitive behavioral therapy, where you recognize about 10 or 15 different distortions, catastrophizing, discounting the positive, mind reading, all these distortions. You learn the names of them. You learn to challenge them. And so he learns that. And then a few years later, only beginning in 2013, 2014, now he sees students doing this, saying, well, if this speaker comes to campus, terrible things will happen, and it'll be bad, and there will be, students will be damaged. So he notices that students are doing exactly the distortions he learned not to do. And he thinks, isn't this going to be bad for them? If these distortions are what make you depressed and anxious, if students are doing this, won't that make them depressed and anxious? And so he came to talk to me. We'd met through a friend at a party in New York. He came to talk to me in May of 2014. He told me his idea, and I thought it was absolutely brilliant because I had just begun to see some of this new way of thinking at NYU, and I was reading about it as well. And I thought, my God, this is a great insight. I would love to join him on this. And I said, I think it's a great idea, Greg. As a psychologist, I think you're really onto something. And if you want me to be a co-author with you, I'd be happy to work on this with you. And he jumped. That was his goal all along. And so we teamed up. We wrote it up. We submitted it to the Atlantic in 2015, January 2015. And it came out in August of 2015. Well, around this time, the New Republic, the New York Times were reporting on these new trends. They were all brand new in 2014. Trigger warnings, safe spaces. This was on the front page of the review section of the New York Times. At Brown, there was a debate between two different feminists, and one of them was skeptical of the idea that America is a rape culture, and some of the students thought this would be so dangerous if she said that on campus. This could be very harmful to students who have been victims of sexual harassment if they hear someone doubt that America is a rape culture. So they need a safe space where they can recover. And a quote on the front page, a debate between these two women could invalidate people's experiences. Now, you would not want a college experience to invalidate ideas that you hold dear, would you? So these sorts of things began happening in 2014, and they were real puzzlements. We had not seen this sort of thing on campus before. This appeared in Vox. I'm a liberal professor, and my liberal students terrify me. So all these things were beginning to come out just in 2014, plus or minus. Google Trends shows that this really was a new thing. Before, the blue line is trigger warning, and the red line is microaggression. These terms just simply, you could find them somewhere, but they didn't register until 2014. So there was something new happening around 2014. Our article came out, that's what we were writing about. The article came out in August of 2015. And then 3 months later, all hell broke loose at Halloween. It began at Yale, and it spread to a lot of other campuses. I won't go through the stories, but there are many, many events where somebody used a single word, or they wrote an email that was trying to be helpful. Someone else took offense, and before you know it, there's big protests and demands, ultimatums given to the college president. So there was a lot of protest on campus in the fall of 2015. Things accelerated, especially after Trump was elected. Obviously, here in the Bay Area, you're all very, very familiar with what happened at Berkeley. A month later, Charles Murray was physically attacked, and a professor was injured, permanently injured, actually. She has neck damage at Middlebury College. And it's just spread. There's not that much violence, thank God, but there's a new idea that if students are upset about something, they can go into a classroom and shut it down. Again, it's not very common, but it's happening enough that administrators are very concerned about this. Professors like me, we teach defensively. We have to be very careful about offending anyone. So I won't go through. There's so many of these stories. The way to recognize this new culture, if you see these terms, safe spaces, trigger warnings, microaggressions, bias response teams, there's a sense that America is a matrix of oppression, and this leads to a call-out culture. Often the biggest events are about a single word. It's often about a word. And so what we think is going on, this was Greg's initial idea, that the students have erroneously come to believe that they are fragile and that they live in an incredibly dangerous or hostile country, world, and university. Now, we can talk about whether the world or the country is more dangerous. In the long run, things are getting safer and safer. Rates of violence are way, way down compared to what they were decades ago. But to say that the university is a dangerous place, that is something new. The idea that students need protection from words, books, and speakers, and if a speaker were to come to campus, even if you don't go, this could be damaging to some students, therefore that person has to be stopped. This is the new idea that emerged in 2014. It It's not on most campuses. There are 4,500 institutions of higher education. Most of them are not experiencing this. But along the coastal strip of the West Coast and in the Northeast, at elite liberal arts colleges and at the top public Ivies, this culture is actually somewhat common, at least as far as I can tell from. So in the book, we go through 6 reasons why this happened. Why did things change so quickly in 2014 to 2017? And so it's a fascinating social science puzzle. Half of the book is a social science detective story to understand why 2014, 2015, what was changing. And so we go through all of these. I won't read them aloud. You can just see the sorts of things that we talk about. The book is organized around this sort of literary philosophical device that there are 3 really, really, really bad ideas. And if we can teach these 3 ideas to our kids, we can't guarantee that they'll fail in life, but we make it very likely that they will not have successful lives. And they are, what doesn't kill you makes you weaker, always trust your feelings, and life is a battle between good people and evil people. And if you can just imagine a young person growing up in America today who embraces those 3 ideas, imagine that person going out and being a force of nature. Imagine that person going out and changing the world. Imagine that person going out and leading a happy, productive life. It's less likely if you embrace those ideas. So I'm just going to talk about the first one. So my first book was called The Happiness Hypothesis. It grew out of my Psych 101 class at the University of Virginia, where I found myself teaching psychology by quoting the ancients. And I thought, if I don't get tenure at UVA, I don't want to transfer to a third-rate school, I'll just try to write this trade book and try to explore how much the ancients knew about psychology. Fortunately, I did get tenure, just barely, but I did get it. And I decided to write the book anyway. And so the book is about 10 ancient ideas. 3 of them are the 3 ideas in the new book. So chapter 7, the uses of adversity. Everybody knows, well, this is the great untruth. Red means bad, wrong, don't believe this. So you all know, as Friedrich Nietzsche said, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. This is a great truth because you find this in all of the world's wisdom traditions. This is from Mencius or Mengzi. When heaven is about to confer a great responsibility on any man, it will exercise his mind with suffering, subject his sinews and bones to hard work, etc., so as to harden his nature and improve wherever he is incompetent. So everybody has recognized this around the world, that we grow from adversity, we need adversity, and if we don't get it, we're soft and weak. Now, the key word here was not invented until just a few years ago. The wonderful word that Nassim Taleb had to invent, because there was no word in the English language, is anti-fragile. Children are anti-fragile. What he means by that is we all talk about resilience, like we want our kids to be resilient, but Taleb was saying there's something better than resilience. And he was studying banking systems, and he pointed out that there are certain systems where if they're fragile, you protect them, and that there are other systems where if they actually need to be damaged, they need to be attacked or shocked in order to grow strong. So something which is resilient, like a plastic cup is resilient, if you drop it on the floor, it won't break, but it doesn't get better when you drop it on the floor. But a banking system actually gets better if it's subjected to shocks. It learns and it develops defenses. And so he goes through an exploration of all these systems. And so bone is an example. If you take it easy on your bones, they get soft, and that's why it's going to be difficult to go to Mars, because you have to keep putting pressure on the bones to keep them hard. The immune system and children are other examples. I'll work through the immune system example because it's the clearest. Why are peanut allergies going up? Peanut allergies have tripled since the 90s. Why? And so the most authoritative study was recently published a couple of years ago, the LEAP study. And what they did is as they say in the write-up to it, peanut allergy is an aberrant response by the body's immune system. Peanuts are not harmful, but there are certain proteins in the little coat, that like reddish thing around the peanut. There are certain proteins that the immune system often fails to learn are harmless, and then it reacts to them unnecessarily. So they point out peanut allergies have doubled. This was a while ago, but only in countries that try to keep pregnant women and toddlers away from peanuts. That's the only place it's going up. And so they did an experiment, a very direct experiment, based on the hypothesis that if you give peanuts to kids, they won't be allergic to them. And that's what they did. So they took 640 kids who were at risk of peanut allergy because they had either eczema or egg allergies, so they had immune issues. And they assigned them randomly to either consume or avoid peanut dust. There's an Israeli snack food. It's like puffed corn with peanut powder on it. And so, of the kids, of the half who were assigned standard procedure, you're at risk of a peanut allergy. No peanuts for you. Mom, don't have any peanut products while you're nursing. 14% of them at age 5 had a peanut allergy. Of the kids who were given peanut stuff to snack on, only 2%. In other words, we could pretty much almost wipe out peanut allergies just by giving peanuts to kids. So the conclusion here was they say, for decades, allergists have been recommending that young infants avoid consuming such foods, but our findings suggest that this advice was incorrect and may have contributed to the rise in peanut allergies. All right, that's what we mean by how good intentions and bad ideas are causing a generation to have peanut allergies. Let's try that again. Let's do not the immune system. Let's do the whole kid, okay? We don't want kids to get hurt. Let's protect them, right? So, and let's keep protecting them. We've got to be there for them. What if your kid gets lost? What if your kid falls down and gets hurt? You've got to be there. You've got to know where your kid is. All the way up through college. What happens after the college graduation? Who's going to help them find a job? So if we do this throughout life, what happens? Now, let's go back and look at childhood. This is a playground from about 100 years ago. This is probably not a good idea because kids could actually die. They could actually break their neck. So this, I think, is too dangerous. This is from a little bit more recently. I think this is probably just about right. That you're not going to die here, but you could get hurt. And most of us who are over 40 remember the jungle gym. And you could actually get hurt on it. But why would we ever let kids get hurt? Why would we ever do that? We should have playgrounds like this, where they can't get hurt. We should have playgrounds like this. Well, here's why. There was a wonderful essay. So Alison Gopnik is a wonderful developmental psychologist at Cal, and she had an article in the Wall Street Journal recently, a year ago, about risk deprivation syndrome. What happens when you keep kids safe from risk? What happens to them? Is it good for them? Are they more likely to grow up and be safe and be happy and be effective in the world? The answer is probably no. And so as she puts it, because she talks about how in Europe they don't do this. In Europe they let the kids go out in the woods, they let them play with knives and saws, and they learn not to cut themselves. So she says, trying to eliminate all such risks from children's lives might be dangerous. There might be a psychological analog to the hygiene hypothesis. That's analogous to the peanut thing. If we keep our kids safe from bacteria, we're crippling their immune systems. They've got to be exposed to bacteria, dirt, germs, even parasitic worms, it turns out. So she says there may be a benefit to having kids take risks. Kids seek out risks, by the way. They try to make things a little riskier, more dangerous. So she says, in the same way, by shielding children from every possible risk, we may lead them to react with exaggerated fear to situations that aren't risky at all, and we isolate them from adult skills that they will one day have to master. So the dictum, this is wisdom, not anti-wisdom. The wisdom, this is just a cultural saying, prepare the child for the road, not the road for the child. And in Britain, Britain does all the same mistakes as we do, but they're ahead of us in learning how to rectify them. They have begun to let kids play with bricks and lumber and things where they could actually get hurt. They're not going to get killed, but they could get hurt. But along the way, they learn how to handle bricks and lumber and not power tools. Let's not give them power saws. But, so the British are realizing we've gone too far. We have to actually let kids take some risks. What are we doing in America? The opposite. We're protecting them all the way up through college. We don't want our college students to face risk. And so what happens? I asked about the year 1995 for a reason. Most people seem to think that college students are millennials. They are not. The millennial generation we all thought was maybe 1982 to 2000. That was a reasonable assumption back in the early 2000s. But it turns out that if you look at graphs, this is a very interesting book by Jean Twenge. She looks at graphs of all kinds of things across the generations. And what she finds is that there's a surprisingly sharp break at birth year 1995. It's about as sharp as birth year 1946 was. 1946 was really the start of a new generation. The war had just ended. And for a variety of reasons, 1995 turns out to be such a break point. I'll just show you a bit of the data. Kids these days, they grow up so slowly. You might think they grow up fast, that's what we used to say, but they don't. They grow up very slowly now. So these are graphs from back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s of do you have a driver's license? And if you're my generation or older, the day you turned 18, you got your license. It was very exciting. But now, but that's been going down. Have you ever tried alcohol? The day you turned 12, you got drunk. But that's, have you ever tried alcohol? That's going down. Have you ever gone out on a date? Anything like a date, going way down. Have you ever had a job? Have you ever worked for pay? All these things are going down. iGen, the generation born after 1985, is having much less independent experience. They're spending a lot more time on their devices, at home, on their bed. And here's the result, or rather, here's one result. We can't say for sure they're connected. Twenge argues they're connected. I think she's probably right. This is, by self-report, across 9 symptoms. If you meet 5 of the 9 symptoms, you're counted as having a major depression. And so girls always have higher rates of depression than boys. Depression and anxiety. Basically, girls have internalizing disorders. That's where you make yourself miserable. Boys are always higher on externalizing disorders, where you make other people miserable. So that's alcoholism, psychopathy, things like that. But the rate for boys, as soon as iGen comes into the picture, the rate for boys begins going up. Now, that's actually a substantial increase as a percentage, but it's nothing compared to what's happened to girls. So the girls' rate of depression has skyrocketed. That's up about 50 to 70%. And there was just an article in the New York Times, Richard Friedman saying, oh, it's just self-report. Don't worry, devices aren't bad. There's not really a rise in anxiety. And I think he's completely wrong, because he wasn't taking account of the suicide data. This is not self-report. This is actual dead teenagers. The rate, so boys have much higher rate, girls do more attempts, but boys have higher completion rates because they tend to use irreversible means. So the rate for boys has been higher in the past, and it has risen, but as a percentage, the rate for girls is risen much, much more. If you take the average of the first decade of the century and compare it to the last couple of years, 70% increase. 7-0 for teenage girls. This is much bigger than any other group. This is a major public health catastrophe. And so then what happens when kids when this generation comes to college? This is data from college students. And what you notice here is that in 2012, again, you see girls have higher rates of depression than boys. These are the last of the millennials. In 2012, there were no members of iGen on campus. It was all millennials. And once iGen comes to campus, the rate for young women shoots up again. Boys goes up, but girls goes up much, much more. And so this is what we've been seeing over the last 4 or 5 years. Counseling centers are completely flooded around the country. They cannot handle the demand for psychological services on campus. So again, we don't know for sure what the cause is, but I think that overprotection, play deprivation, risk deprivation, and social media are the big reasons for this. We don't know yet. This is all so new. The data, it's only in the last 2 years that we're recognizing that this is happening. So that, I think, is another example of how, while we're trying to protect our kids, I think we're really hurting them. So as I said, the book is based around these 3 great untruths. Each one violates a basic psychological principle. And with that, I look forward to talking with Quentin and then hearing your questions. Thank you.
You did all the heavy lifting for me. I do want to point out that in that playground shot from 100 years ago, everybody in that picture is dead now. You draw your own conclusions, huh? You know?
Life is a fatal condition.
I believe in data. Okay. So to recapitulate a little bit about your thesis, and by the way, It's number 7 on the Times bestseller list in the first week. Congratulations. This obviously resonates. That's very good. You seem to be saying that something's happened quite acutely in the last few years in particular. This was latent, but it's kind of exploded.
Right.
And as I read the book, I was struck by how many of the anecdotes were in elite universities. And I wanted to ask you if you thought this was a problem among elite universities or something more broad-based in the country.
Yes. So the increase in depression and anxiety cuts across races and social classes. Jean Twenge has data on that. So there are 6 threads that all come together. The depression thread is not at all restricted to the elite.
Yes, there is a 70% increase in teenage female suicide. That's nationwide.
That's right.
Cross-cuts, race, class, what have you. Okay.
But the new culture of safetyism, the idea that that if somebody says something, we should use the language of safety and danger when we go to the dean to demand that he do something about that person. Most working class students would hear that and say, what? What do you mean dangerous? Like danger? So I think the safetyism culture is limited to, it can only exist in a school where you have students coming in at the age of 18, staying together for 4 years, and not going home. So I don't think this could exist at a commuter school, because as soon as you go home, you say these things, and your parents are like, what? This doesn't make any sense. So it's mostly at elite schools in very, I'm sorry, I don't want to bring the politics into it, but it does, the shout-downs, the really strong stuff only happens in very blue areas.
Well, let me push back on that a little bit, because perhaps the safetyism is a symptom of something larger, which would be this idea that people, in particular young people who have no experience of the past, treat the world now as full of catastrophe. And this catastrophizing of life, as you put it, this psychological dilemma of seeing everything in these utter terms, could be the reason you're also seeing this rise in depression and this inability to cope with life.
Right.
And so the safetyism of the universities is one response. But you're seeing, when you see things like certain types of speech codes at conservative universities, or people driving their students, their children to charter schools that teach along a certain philosophic line, aren't you seeing the same thing with another phenomenon?
So efforts to restrict speech go back thousands and thousands of years. As long as there's been language, there have been some people who said that's blasphemy, we're going to kill you or expel you.
Yeah.
So when conservatives do it, it tends to be of that sort. And every group does that. What's new is the idea that we have to shut you up because what you say will physically harm. It will damage the bodies and minds. Well, no, it's the idea of safety and danger. And here, I want to actually bring back the politics, because part of what's going on here, I believe, is that the students themselves are not really that fragile. There are many more with anxiety and depression, that's true. But the ones who are saying this tend not to be saying, I will be damaged. They tend to be saying they will be damaged. So it's a kind of politics and protest that says, I am standing up for a marginalized group, I'm standing up for a group of victims, so you have to shut up, you have to shut him up to protect them, not me, them.
That's an extraordinary phenomenon, and self-organized, essentially.
Yes, it's completely self-organized among the students. And it's always it's a small group of students. It's not, most students are doing fine. Most students are perfectly happy. They come to college, they want to learn. But I think one thing that's happening to our whole society, because of the combination of social media and rising cross-partisan hatred, we really, really hate each other in this country, much more than we did 10 or 20 years ago. So you come into a campus that is fairly politically homogeneous, organized around progressive politics, and you have social media allowing people to organize, you get this much more expressive brand of politics. And the game that we play at universities of truth-seeking can't happen if other people are playing the game of political warfare.
Mm-hmm. Can you see this? What effect do you think this will have 5 years out, say?
Because if you look at the 6 trends that we point to, none of them are going to be reversing themselves anytime soon unless we do something. So I think things are likely to get worse, possibly a lot worse, unless we do something. when we wrote our article, people said, in 2015, people said, oh, come on, it's just students being students. When they go out into the real world, they're going to have to change. And we thought that might be true. But now it's clear, I hear from journalists, any industry that hires from these elite schools and has a lot of young people, they don't change. They say, you have to do something. You have to do something about that person. And so you see this in newsrooms. So I think it's going to, in media, tech, tech, of course, there's been a lot of issues in tech. So I think it's going to take over the corporate world. I think we'll see a decline of 5 to 10% of GDP, and I think we'll see a rise of litigation related to employment. If you have children who want a career, tell them to go into employment law. That's my prediction.
Fairly comprehensive. For those,
or buy the book and implement the changes, and this bad future will not be the Christmas future, whatever the... Yeah.
So if I wait for the paperback version, will it be a 3% decline in GDP? But for those listening on the radio, I'd like to point out that we're both old white dudes. Are you sort of aware of the line, check your privilege, and did you discount for this in writing the book?
Yeah, we were basically writing in fear of it because that is pretty much the only argument we've ever gotten. What I mean is, when we wrote the Atlantic article and we made these arguments about mental health, and we tried to avoid the politics and really just focus on what do we know about psychology, what do we know about how you overcome trauma, about how you need to dishabituate to you need to habituate to stimuli. So we wrote a very psychological piece, and we were expecting all kinds of pushback. And pretty much the only argument we got was you're white men protecting your privilege. So we're used to that. And one thing I began to think, like, what do I say to that? And I think maybe what I should say is, okay, suppose that's true. That could very well be true. That might influence why we tend to take this view. And if you're of a different category, you tend to take a different view. That might well be true. But that has nothing to do with whether the psychological arguments are true. And people are anti-fragile. It doesn't matter if you're male or female or black or white. Everybody's anti-fragile.
Right.
And so until people come back and actually address our arguments, it doesn't really matter what race we are.
Well, and to carry that through, if you want to abide by your lesson, you should welcome this conflict. But they have to keep arguing.
Well, no,
with you
I would
anyway.
love it. If people would give us counter arguments, I'd love it.
If it didn't end there,
Yeah.
you'd be fine. You're
Right.
saying.
That's right. Because basically, just to say you're white dudes protecting your privilege, it's a quasi ad hominem argument. You're saying we put an argument out there. What's your response? Oh, your race and gender. So it's not exactly ad hominem, but it's sort of like that.
It's difficult to work with it as an argument.
It doesn't
certainly.
lead anywhere productive.
And you point up this very interesting sort of paradox, which is to say, not feeling safe, or not feeling like your group is safe, or not feeling like words are safe and encounters with difficulty are safe, promotes danger. It's very self-fulfilling, isn't it?
That's right. You get self-fulfilling prophecies. That's right. Yeah. So, on campus in the last 20 or 30 years, or really since the 80s, we've been very aware that words can have effects. And so we worked very, very hard. If you refer to mankind, might this have a bad effect on women who think that this doesn't include that? Maybe. It might have a small effect. There's not a lot of evidence, but it's plausible. And so we work on cleaning up our language in all kinds of ways. And then to just suddenly put out there that members of all these different groups should define themselves as marginalized. Wow. Are you kidding me? You're going to tell, the kids of, Haitian immigrants who've been working hard and that community's rising up, you're going to tell them, you're marginalized. Everyone's against you. This is a really bad thing to do for them.
And you've tied the positivity to this idea of anti-fragility, which in a sense is a kind of ecological argument. Let me encounter as many behaviors and things as possible so that I can deal with change as readily as possible. Well, in a world where we all acknowledge social and technological change are going to accelerate, you really don't want to put your kids in this mental position.
Yeah.
You want to think them capable of encountering difference and doing something.
Right. That's right. So we're in the interesting position that if you look at what it's like to be a kid, what dangers do you actually face? It gets safer and safer. It's unbelievably safe. Threats from almost everything are going down, down, down. The survival rates go up, up, up. But at the same time, the internet has guaranteed that there will be offensive language for the rest of their lives. And so at the very time when we can let our kids out. So, Gen X was the last generation that was allowed to go outside and play, and they were going out and playing at the height of the crime wave. And then just as crime begins to plummet, we take iGen and we say, you can't go outside and play, you're going to be abducted. And at the same time that we're overprotecting them physically, then the internet comes along, and now there's going to be words around them, negative words, and racism and sexism and nasty comments for the rest of their lives.
So can we spend a couple minutes blaming the parents?
Oh, yeah, so it's always popular to do because they love.
Well, they raised them.
Yeah.
Who else you got? What do you think's going on?
So there are some broad social trends that explain why we did this to our kids. One of the biggest, so if you remember the Bowling for Columbine thesis, Michael Moore's movie from the 80s about why Americans freaked out but Canadians didn't, because our cable TV immersed us in stories of violence and things like that. So the media system, we got cable TV and then the internet. So we got scared out of our minds by anecdotes, by individual cases. Even though crime was going down, our fear of crime did not go down. So that's one thing. Another thing is all around the world, as countries get wealthier, and as women get more educated, women go into the workforce, family size shrinks. So it's one thing if the average family size is 3 or 4 or 5, there are a lot of kids around. And, I hate to put it this way, but if you have 5 kids, you're not as paranoid about them as if you have 1.
As the fifth child in my family, I can testify.
So this is happening all over the world. You see it in Korea too. So people are more protective for a lot of reasons. The other really bad thing that happened in the 90s was there was this stupid idea that if you let your kids hear Mozart in the womb, they're going to be smarter. And that was completely debunked, totally untrue. Okay, but we got it in our heads that early exposure to things will get them. They'll get a head start. Let's give them more math. Let's give them more spelling. Let's do it in kindergarten. And that was completely wrong. In Scandinavia, they don't start any of the academic stuff until age 7, which is right. Kids need to play. That's really all they need to do is play when they're young. But we've said, the play, no, that's not important. We need to give them more academics. So we deprive them of play. We've deprived them of risk. We overprotect them. We don't let them develop normal skills of association. And then we send them off to college.
Let me tell you a story. When I started out in journalism, I was on this oil wire where I had to stay up all night and read the news from around the world and figure out what to send out to financial markets. And that meant I read about shootings in Africa and earthquakes in Paramaribo and disease outbreaks in Indonesia. All night long I was reading this terrible stuff. And some of it mattered to markets and some of it didn't. But suddenly I had this kind of window on the catastrophe of the world ongoing. And, the AP never wrote a story, kid learns to walk.
That's right.
Husband gets home early, bakes great pie. That you don't see those stories. You just see this terror. And we actually talked about this because typically somebody would get this job and within about 2 or 3 weeks, they'd start washing their hands more. And they'd call up their wife or husband and say, how you doing, honey? Just checking in, or talk about some crazy person they saw on the street. And over time, we actually joked about this, that you're in this catastrophe zone at first because you start externalizing this and it's your mental landscape changing. But then you also had the time away from work and you normalized it and you put it in perspective and I'm just seeing the world in this strange lens. My education as a journalist is like everybody's normal reality now.
Yeah, that's right.
Where you get all of the world's catastrophes rushing at you. Do you think that plays a role?
I do. That certainly explains part of why we're more fearful and overprotective. But I'd push it a step further. A lot of what we're sharing now, if you look at what people share on social media, it's not mudslides in Maracaibo or whatever you said. It's outrage.
Capital of Suriname. I didn't know until I got the mudslide.
What we're sharing, what we're drowning in, what we are being force-fed is, here's some stupid person on the other side politically who said some horrible thing.
Yeah.
And what's happening on campus, as I said, is very largely a part of the culture war. Students are very political. They always have been. It varies by decade, but they're very political. And so the students, as it's happening nationally, when I was a kid, I was always on the left, and I hated, Nixon was my first political memory, and you'd hear about some terrible thing that the Republicans did. Like every month, it seemed they did something terrible. And now it's every minute. Like every minute, there's a new thing that everyone's upset about. And so if you can imagine, how could we ever compromise with the other side? They're the evilest things that ever lived. And so, that's both ways I'm saying here. So I think that the social media landscape has, just as it did to you with the sense of danger, I think the sense of outrage, that's actually much more dangerous for our democracy. It's when you can have a democracy where people are afraid of mudslides, but you can't have a democracy where people are totally convinced with a lot of video evidence that the other side is so evil that we really need to just get rid of them.
Yeah, you speak of this as a problem in tech, and this is particularly paradoxical to me because I've been thinking a lot about how in learning difficult things, math and sciences in particular, how important it is to be wrong. You only learn by being wrong.
Well,
and the thing they don't teach
you
you
learn
about math
faster. You can learn by being right, but you learn better.
No, but if you're
wrong.
right all the time, you're almost not doing the work, or else you're a genius. You're seeing the world too uniquely. And one of the smartest people I've ever met, got really excited one time and he said, "Oh my God, I think I'm wrong. I'm going to learn something new." And we don't teach being wrong very well. And so it's acute. It's kind of funny you should say this in tech because competence in tech involves wondering if you're not right. And the problem you have in the safety world is I'm going to be challenged and that'll give me anxiety. And these two different things are kind of encountering each other.
That's right. That's great because that's one of the key things about play, play versus competition. So when it's the Little League Championship, you don't say, "Oh, I'm so glad I dropped that fly ball. I got to learn something."
No.
But when you're playing,
a year before?
You try something harder. Like, let's try throwing it in a mirror. Oh, I missed. But it's fun. So in play, we can explore that. We try things and we can fail.
Right.
But the more competitive society becomes, the more competitive college admission becomes, the less, the more frightening failure becomes.
Yes, you can't be seen as slipping.
Right.
Let me take a question from the audience. I worry about these concepts creeping into high schools or even elementary schools.
They're there already.
I would cite an article in today's Atlantic talking about high school students saying some people have anxiety, we should not be forced to give public presentations.
Because they don't feel emotionally safe.
And the other side of the argument is 90% of employers want people who communicate well. You're only going to learn it if you get up there and do it, dare I say, be wrong. And,
that's right. Can I ask you
to learn how to be better?
Can I ask you to tell the story about your son that you told me in the green room?
Well, sure.
You can answer the question better.
Well, I can tell the story. It's his story, but he owned it publicly. So my son has an autistic spectrum disorder where anxiety is part of the factor. And he went to a school out in Orinda that's quite good at taking care of people with this condition. And one of the things they did was every semester, every student had to give a PowerPoint presentation. And the parents had to sit through them. And they ground it, and they ground it, and they ground it. And long story short, my son was the valedictorian of his university. So, he wasn't good, he got better.
Yeah.
Right. I don't want to universalize that. That's his story, but it's a powerful anecdote.
Yeah. I mean that when we face challenges, you can either say, "I'm anxious, therefore I'm unsafe, therefore I shouldn't do it," or we can say, "I'm anxious, and if I do it and then nothing terrible happens to me, next time I face it, I'll be less anxious."
Well,
that's called extinction of a response.
That is a good segue to the part of your cure for this, your diagnosis and cure, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. Mm-hmm. And you say, the phenomenon exists, and they're experiencing all of the negativity, and they're not taking on the positivity from CBT. So why don't you spend a minute talking about that?
So in the 1980s, there was a big emphasis on teaching critical thinking. And you don't hear about it anymore because it didn't work. You can't just in class, okay, now let's all learn to think better. But actually there is one way that does. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. Because the thing is, you don't just tell people how to think better. You practice identifying specific distortions. In CBT, you say, "Oh, I totally blew that interview, and now I'm never going to get a job." And the therapist says, "Okay, what's the evidence that you blew? Give me evidence." And you realize, well, you don't actually have evidence. So you work through these things. This is critical thinking. You're grounding your claims in evidence. and you're learning to extract, what can you infer from this? This is actually critical thinking. So Greg and I feel very strongly that given that there is a mental health crisis among adolescents, and CBT is the best validated kind of therapy that there is, we think that it should be a standard part of growing up in high school and certainly in college that you learn CBT. And even for the large majority of people who aren't depressed and anxious, it's just good thinking skills. So we think that colleges are putting more and more money into all kinds of remedial problems. They face all kinds of problems. There's a very simple solution. It's very cheap. You can learn it by an app. In the appendix to the book, we give links to apps and programs that can teach you. So we think it's very effective.
I would also urge people to break out of whatever regimented norm they're in. If you shop at Safeway, go to Whole Foods. If you shop at Whole Foods, go to Safeway. In counterparts of America, shop at Walmart for that matter. In counterparts of America that aren't like your experience. And you also speak for national service.
That's right. So that brings up the other issue. So social media has affected us in a number of ways. Actually, you know what? Let's do more questions. This is the time we could just go off and talk all night. So let's do more questions.
Please note the impact of increased screen time versus face-to-face conversation.
Yeah, this we think is a big one. Kids need to do all sorts of things for thousands and thousands of hours, and screens are so pleasant and addictive. Most of us, when we were kids, it was television, and our elders thought that we were rotting our minds from television. And there may have been some truth to that. But screens, because it's two-way, it's so much more interactive. And I should work in a video. I have a video of my daughter calling out to me when she was 7. Daddy, can you take away my iPad? I can't take my eyes off of it. She literally could not raise her head up from the iPad, and she recognized that. Wow. So to the extent that, so it looks as though, I don't want to cause a panic here, the evidence suggests that an hour or two a day doesn't seem to be correlated with any problems. But when you go above 2 hours a day, there's a dose-response curve where, 3 or 4 hours you have more rates of mental illness, and 5 or 6 you have more. There could be some reverse causality, but Twenge goes through reasons to think that it probably is causal in the direction that we think. So yeah, screens are not dangerous in low doses, but in high doses, you're basically depriving your kids of the social nutrients they need.
Okay. Someone in the audience wants to know about the litigious society. Does the fear of lawsuits create helicopter parents and overprotection?
The fear of lawsuits, it's not so much that it creates helicopter parents, it creates helicopter institutions. So schools should give a lot less supervision to playtime. But if you do that, if there's one more case of bullying, the parents can sue you. So it's always better, from their perspective, it's always better to over-supervise. So my daughter, the same daughter, when she was just last year in 3rd grade, she told me, on the playground, if somebody says to someone else, I don't like the way you did your hair, and that girl cries, an adult will come over. What's going on, girls? What happened? And what this breeds is what's called moral dependency. Because adults are always there, ready to jump in, and they're there in part because institutions are afraid of lawsuits. So that's part of why they over-supervise. So this prevents kids from learning how to resolve conflicts on their own.
I'll try to reframe this question. It's interesting. You're making an argument that the culture of safetyism has tangible negative impacts.
Yes.
Why should we believe that argument and not a similar argument that cultures that reinforce negative stereotypes are not equally able to have negative impacts?
Wait, what is it? What's this last part?
That cultures that reinforce negative stereotypes, if we allow negative stereotypes, isn't that just as bad as not allowing, as having speech codes?
Well, I think there's two separate things here. One is, what do we do about stereotypes and racism? And another is, do we have a culture of safetyism in which people are fragile? I think you would do everyone a disservice if you say we should not have stereotypes because they will damage people. It would be much more productive to say you shouldn't have stereotypes because they will offend people, it's the idea that they will be damaged and therefore need protection.
Right. It's not that Charles Murray may or may not be a racist. It's that hearing Charles Murray will hurt me is
right. And because Charles Murray wasn't there to speak about race, he was there to speak about social class. But the Middlebury students construed it that if he were allowed to speak about anything, this would cause damage. Now, what lesson does that teach? If you're a black student at Middlebury and you're told that if Charles Murray goes anywhere and says anything, this is a danger to me, how is this helping that student?
Okay. Did Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind, which predicted the negative effects of postmodernism on elite universities in the 80s, influence your book?
Yeah.
Are you Alan Bloom Redux?
Yeah. So I had never actually read the Alan Bloom book until last summer, because the title was made up at the last minute by the editors at The Atlantic. Our original title was Arguing Towards Misery, which is a bad title, but it's what the article was about. And the editors of The Atlantic made up the Coddling the American Mind. It sounded catchy. Greg and I didn't like it because it seemed insulting to students, but we couldn't come up with anything better, so we went with it. And only this summer did I read just the first half of it. It's a very interesting book. But he was talking about the sort of the relativism, the lack of morality, the lack of a common a sense of a moral order. Is the problem of, and now actually the problem we have is a really intense morality that is very unforgiving.
Yeah,
so I think it's a very different.
His touchstone was the mayhem at Cornell when he was teaching there.
Yeah,
and this is almost the opposite of mayhem.
Yeah, and also, he's writing from a cultural conservative point of view, and we're not. We're writing more from a mental health point of view. We're not. I mean, neither Greg and I have never voted for Republican in our lives. We're sort of, Greg calls himself sort of left libertarian, and I call myself a centrist who dislikes the Republican Party intensely. So it's very different, and our goals are very different.
I spent 10 years doing a show on Fox. I'm sure we can get along. Will companies that practice safetyism become less competitive to ones that don't?
I would think so, yes. Imagine any cooperative group where people are both competing and cooperating. It's really hard to do. Now imagine that we also decide, you know what, we want to make things more diverse. And we do this in our companies, we do it in our corporation, in our universities. So these are all good things to do. Now imagine that along with making things more diverse and having all these conflicting motives, we say, now let's have a whole new set of norms where people are allowed to take offense at almost anything, and not just take offense. If they take offense, there has to be an administrative remedy. An administrative remedy. Imagine what it would be like to run such a company. Imagine what it would be like to run such a university. Imagine spending almost all of your day addressing internal conflicts rather than making a better product at a lower cost. So yeah, I think that if this safety culture spreads, because it is at heart, it's not necessarily about true fragility. It's a way of fighting moral and political battles of us versus them. And the more our institutions become, the more everything becomes politics all the time, the less competitive we're going to be.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would also argue from my experience writing about business, one of the hardest acts in any organization, but a business organization, is to say, what if we're wrong? Mm. And if you have a culture of safetyism, that's just going to be one more difficulty in questioning.
That's right. That's right. What we need to be doing as we are trying to diversify everything, we do need to teach people to give less offense. The norms about intercultural contact do need to be taught. But at the same time that we're trying to teach everyone to give less offense, we have to also teach people to give each other the benefit of the doubt. In other words, to take less offense. Otherwise, all that happens is we just keep moving the goalposts. So we have ever lower standards for what counts as offensive, but we have a constant conservation of offense. In other words, we make no progress. We just make life harder for ourselves. That's what I think we're doing.
Mm. We keep identifying new areas of offense.
Well, that's why it's called microaggression. And a microaggression, by definition, is a millionth of an aggression. Or whatever. Is it micro? Is it a millionth?
So are we heading to pico-aggressions and like nano-aggressions?
Yes, that's right. People started talking about those. Yeah.
I'm going to retire. Do you think school administrators are doing the students and the teachers a disservice? What should the administration be doing differently?
Well, they're in a very tough spot. We have a whole chapter on administrators, and it's fashionable to blame them, But they have a very hard job, and part of the reason their job is so hard is that we on the faculty who used to run things, we're perfectly happy to not do any committee work, to just do our research and minimal teaching, and to leave everything else to administrators who generally don't come from an academic background. So their instinct is not, well, let's defend academic freedom. It's let's defend the institution against lawsuits and bad publicity. That's what they're judged on. So they're all good people. There are no villains in our book. They're all good people doing the job as they find it. I think what we need is a common language in universities and more broadly in America. We need a common language to understand what are our difficulties, what are the difficulties as we go on in a more polarization is here to stay. How do we adapt to that? So administrators, I'm hopeful that, because one thing I'm finding, administrators now recognize their job is impossible. This is true in universities, and I think it's going to spread to many other organizations. Maybe it's true in high schools too, or other schools. It's always been difficult. So I think they're looking for a way out of this. And I'm hopeful that the book will give people a common language and a reason to say, at a certain point, we can't solve problems. We have to let the students solve problems.
So they're all good people trying their best, and it's going off the rails. That's the stuff of tragedy.
Yeah. Well, that's the stuff of social science. I mean, that's, this isn't about good and evil.
Right.
This is about complex social systems in which people have diverse morals and diverse material goals all put together in a constantly changing environment with a new media ecosystem and Russian trolls manipulating us to get even angrier at each other.
Right.
So it's really hard nowadays.
Right.
And I think most, raise your hand if you feel as though America has just gone so deeply into the twilight zone that you don't know what the hell's going on. Raise your hand, okay? Like, we've got problems in this country, and it's not going to be solved by us getting even more angry at the people we love to hate. It's going to be solved by stepping back and saying, what is happening to us?
Yes. Maybe they're right too. What if I'm wrong?
Yeah.
Right. You mean act like a real democracy where we listen to the other side and question our own thinking?
Well, but there's an article in the Atlantic today about, I haven't read the article yet, but it's about how we are living Madison's nightmare. Madison and the founders knew that direct democracy is a terrible thing because you get just mobs at each other's throats. And that's why we have a republic and a limited democracy. And I'm guessing the article is going to say, again, it just came out today or yesterday, guessing it's going to say that there's always been the issue of mobs, but with social media, suddenly the mobs are vastly more powerful and influential. And we've seen a lot of cases of mobs forcing institutions to change decisions recently.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and they seem like enormously powerful groups.
Right,
They're
7 people on
vocal.
Twitter can end up,
Okay. Have you seen any parallels to this in other countries? Is this a uniquely American problem?
It's uniquely Anglosphere. All of the Anglo countries have it. None of the European countries have it. So it's exactly the same it's almost the same in Canada and the UK. Canada is that somebody's phone?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Keep going.
The damn phones.
I had to check his Twitter.
So the UK is only about 6 months to a year behind us in all of these trends. They're getting all of these things. They're different because they have these student unions. Their student unions are very politicized. They're different from ours. There's some difference, but Canada, the UK, and Australia are very similar. Whereas in France and Germany, they're laughing at us. One reason is because we modeled our university system on Oxford and Cambridge. So we have residential colleges. So our elite schools, it's a very intense social experience. You live together. And so this new morality of safetyism, it cannot survive the light of day if it goes out into the broader world, but it can survive at Middlebury or on an elite college campus. But in Germany and France, they don't have that. They have more commuter schools. They don't all live together for 4 years. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the reasons.
Now, an audience question. The University of Chicago sends all incoming freshmen a letter disavowing illiberal speech, safe spaces, and what you call safetyism.
Yes.
What's going on with college administrators who tolerate this behavior? And what do you think led Chicago to behave differently?
Yeah. So Chicago, I did my postdoc at the University of Chicago. I love the place. It is the most intellectually intense place in America. They had, the students have T-shirts, University of Chicago, where fun goes to die. Hell does freeze over. Like, they're proud of the reputation for argumentation. So they have the moral resources to stand out. And they also have Robert Zimmer also. They've had a succession of strong presidents. So they're the closest thing to Plato's Republic. Plato's Academy, thank you. They're the closest thing we have in this country to that. So they staked out a position rejecting that. Now, there was an error in the letter. The dean never should have said that, you don't accept safe spaces. There's a right of association. If students want to form a safe space, they can. What he meant to say, and I spoke to him about this, what he meant to say was our classrooms are not safe spaces. That is, obviously there's no physical violence, but people will critique your ideas. That's going to happen in class. So Chicago is wonderful. I think it's the best school in the country. I would much rather my kids go there than to any of the Ivies. And the problem, as you see in our book, we go through case after case. The presidents are terrified. And over again, I've spoken to many college presidents. They all favor free speech. They all have good liberal values, liberal in the sense of they believe in the university as a liberal institution. And almost every one of them is terrified. So they don't stand up. They don't, like when the Christakis, when Eric and Nicholas Christakis did what anybody from the outside would say, these were beautiful deeds. Erica Christakis wrote a very thoughtful letter based on her research in psychology on how students should think for themselves and not be guided by administrators. And the Yale leadership never stood up for them. They were mobbed, they were humiliated, there were demands for them to be fired, and the Yale leadership never, leadership should be saying, yes, you have a legitimate complaint here, but on the other hand, the leadership should have tried to say something to stand up for the faculty members. They didn't.
On the assumption that you're fully tenured, how are things at NYU?
Well, so it's not about tenure. It's not about losing your job. Well, I shouldn't say that because many people have lost their jobs, actually on the right and the left. The dynamics are such that this is now bipartisan. The fear isn't so much losing your job. The fear is being shamed and having your reputation attacked publicly.
To get back to my question, how are the administrators at NYU? How are the students at NYU these days?
Because we're being filmed, I don't want to answer that. I will just say, that at Stern, I am given enormous leeway to develop my ideas as I see fit. I have the strong support of my dean at Stern, and Stern has been wonderful. And also business schools, like engineering schools, don't have a lot of this. It's especially, the safety culture is especially in the humanities, education schools, social work. There's a few other departments, but business schools, engineering schools, there's a few others that don't.
Does this get back to my earlier point that people have to learn how to be wrong and therefore they get a little tougher? Is this a uniquely humanities problem where that isn't practiced as often?
I don't think it's that. I think it's the politics of it. I think that because again, a lot of this isn't really about fragility. It's about political warfare, and I think the particular politics of the humanities is such that they go in for these, again, not to prosecute their case politically, I believe.
Mm-hmm. And in your setup, this is another question from the audience. In your setup, you talk about sort of the overvalence to trusting your feelings and the power of emotions. Are you dismissing emotion? Do you think there is a place for gut?
Yeah. Well, so my book, The Righteous Mind, was all about how, in fact, we're driven by our intuitions. We are emotional creatures. And the view that I've come to take is that we are emotional creatures who are really good at post hoc reasoning, and we're really good at justifying what we want to believe. The magic of a university is that you put people together who disprove each other's confirmation biases. So that's why it works. And if we start saying, you know what, you have your reality, you have yours, how dare you question her reality? You're invalidating her reality, you're invalidating her existence, you can't do that. When you keep it on the plane of argument based on evidence, that's the game we've been playing for thousands of years. Not perfectly, not at all times, but at our best, that's what we do. And to now have put people in who say, different rules, you can't criticize my claims or my ideas, this is the way I feel. Mm-hmm. It's like a metaphor that I use is like, I go out there and I play tennis every day, but beginning in 2014, you hit the ball over the net and then someone jumps across and tackles you. You say, what? And they say, well, we're playing football. I say, no, we're playing tennis. Like, if we're playing different games on campus, nothing works.
Mm-hmm. I see. It just occurred to me that we have spent an enormous amount of time discussing what you see as a real chaotic and dangerous situation for the future of the country that will affect the economy and our institutions. And it has a lot to do with an excess of negativity and a kind of catastrophizing. Mm-hmm. I've got 2 minutes for you to say something positive. How do we fix this?
Yeah. So So I think actually we are in sort of the emperor's new clothes phase, where most people realize things are really messed up. Most people want to change. When I talk with other parents, nobody defends, or I shouldn't say nobody, most people don't defend helicopter parenting. Most of us want to give our kids more independence, but it's a social coordination problem. You can't just send your kids out by themselves. I try to do it with my kids, and they say, there are no other kids out there. People look at me funny. So the parenting problem we can solve. First, we kill all the lawyers. No, we do have to address the law issue. But go to letgrow.org. That is an organization started by Lenore Skenazy, who wrote the book Free Range Kids. I'm on the board of it, along with Peter Gray, who studies play. We were trying to solve the social coordination problem so that parents and communities that care about this can actually designate a backyard or a park, a place where the kids can go. And you talk with the police, and they know not to arrest the parents if the kids go there to play. So the will is there.
If they drift off it, they can?
What?
If they drift away from the park, they can?
How many of you ever drifted away from a park when you were a kid? I mean, yeah, they
That's
can.
the park.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
My God.
Yeah. So we can solve the parenting problems, actually. It's just a coordination problem. The university problems we can also solve. We have all kinds of suggestions in the book. The other big suggestion, go to openmindplatform.org. Me and my team, we've developed a program that walks you through the basic moral psychology to understand why do we get caught in these moralistic spirals? Why do we find it so difficult to talk across the political divide? A lot of places, a lot of schools now actually want to work on this. They want to produce students who can engage with people of varying political views. So a lot of people are working on this now. And this is why I think the libertarians, and Steve Pinker was in to give a talk recently, they generally say things are actually getting better and people are always catastrophizing, because the bigger a problem gets, the more people work on it. And people are creative, people are inventive. We're really good at solving problems. We've solved almost every problem until now, and global warming is very serious, but we are likely to solve it eventually. We might run out of time, but I think we're going to, I don't know.
Don't catastrophize.
So the optimistic thing is to say that, yes, things look bad now. In the book, we're pointing to some very worrying trends. They're not... But it's not that a generation has lost its minds. Most kids are fine. Most universities are still working more or less properly. Things are getting worse, okay, sorry.
We got at least 90 seconds of positivity there.
That well-intentioned people of good faith, even if they differ in their politics, can come together to help kids and universities.
Tell me 3 things you've done in life or as a parent, or you wish you'd done as a consequence of writing this book, that people can take and think about doing in their homes.
So I only read Lenore Skenazy's book, Free Range Kids. It's a wonderful book. I only read it about 3 or 4 years ago when my son was already 8 or 9. I wish I had done a lot more of this with my kids when they were very young. You can't overprotect a toddler, but by the time they're 5 or 6, you really can be giving them a lot more worldly experience. You see these shows in Japan where they send 4-year-olds out to do errands. Not that we can do that in New York, but it's actually pretty safe. Anyway, so I wish I had done a lot more free-range stuff with my kids. I wish I'd been much more active in trying to get the school to change. My kids go to public school in New York City. They're generally pretty good, but they're very overprotective. So I wish I had worked more with schools and other parents in the area, because it's hard to solve these problems yourself.
Mm-hmm. Encouraging children to become resilient.
Yeah.
At an age where those immune systems can be built.
Encouraging adults and institutions to leave room for children to have the experiences that will lead them to become resilient.
Yes.
It's not something we teach.
Kids
it's something we have to give them the room to learn.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. Our thanks to Jonathan Haidt, Thomas Cooley Professor of Ethical Leadership at NYU's Stern School of Business, and co-author of his new book, The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. We'd also like to thank the Ken and Jack Broad Family Fund for their generous support of this conversation. A reminder to our audience that John will be signing copies of The Coddling of the American Mind outside in just a minute, so be sure to pick up a copy on your way out. I'm Quentin Hardy, and now this meeting of the Commonwealth Club, the place where you're in the know, is adjourned.
Thanks, everyone.